I never believed in aliens until one stood at the foot of my bed and spoke to me about Jesus, and what it revealed shattered everything I thought I knew about God, faith, and why we're really here. It happened on a night like any other, or so I thought, when I woke from sleep with that strange certainty that I was not alone in the darkness of my room. My eyes opened not to the familiar shadows I'd grown accustomed to, but to a light soft, golden, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match the very beating of my heart. At first, I thought I was dreaming, that place between sleep and waking where the mind plays tricks and reality bends. But the air itself had changed, thickened with a presence so profound that my body locked in place, unable to move, unable to even draw a full breath. The figure stood there, radiant yet not blinding, its form both solid and translucent, as if it existed in my room and somewhere else entirely at the same moment. I felt no fear, and that was perhaps the strangest part of all. Instead, a peace washed over me, the kind of peace that doesn't make sense when you're facing the impossible, the kind that can only come from something holy. Yet beneath that peace was awe, raw and trembling, the kind that makes you feel small and significant all at once, like a child before the ocean or a soul before the throne of heaven. I wanted to speak, to ask what this was, who this was, but my voice wouldn't come. And then I realized with a shock that sent electricity down my spine I didn't need to speak at all. The communication came not through my ears but directly into my mind, into the deepest part of my being where thoughts are born and truth is recognized before it's even understood. Do not be afraid, it said without saying, the words appearing in my consciousness like memories that had always been there, waiting to be remembered. I have come to you because you have been searching, because your heart has asked questions that the world cannot answer, and because the time has come for you to know what humanity was never meant to forget. Every syllable, if they could be called that, resonated through my chest, my bones, my spirit, carrying a weight of authority and tenderness that reminded me of how Scripture describes the voice of God, like many waters, like thunder wrapped in love. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I hadn't realized I was crying, my body responding to a reality my mind was still struggling to accept. This being, whatever it was, whoever it was, knew me, not just my name or my history, but the architecture of my soul, the prayers I'd whispered in secret, the doubts I'd harbored in shame, the longing I'd carried for something more than what this world offers. You have been taught many things about the one you call Jesus, it continued, and at the mention of that name, the light intensified, the room seemed to expand, and I felt the presence of something even greater hovering, just beyond the veil of what I could perceive. But there is a story beneath the story, a truth that connects heaven and earth, a revelation that will unite faith and the cosmos in ways your teachers never told you. My mind raced through everything I'd ever learned in church, in Sunday school, in years of reading Scripture, and seeking to understand the mysteries of God, and I realized with startling clarity that there had always been gaps, questions I'd been taught not to ask, passages that hinted at something larger. Who were the sons of God in Genesis? What did Yeshua mean when he said he had sheep not of this fold? Why did the prophets describe wheels within wheels, and beings covered in eyes, and encounters that sounded less like simple visions and more like something ancient humanity had no vocabulary to properly explain? The being seemed to sense my thoughts, my sudden cascade of connections, and I felt what could only be described as a smile, not on a face but in the atmosphere itself, a warm approval of my willingness to question, to seek, to open my mind beyond the boundaries I'd been given. You are beginning to understand, it communicated, and now the light at the foot of my bed began to shift and swirl, taking on colors I had no names for, hues that don't exist in our spectrum, as if I was seeing through new eyes, perceiving dimensions my human senses were never designed to register. What I am about to show you has been witnessed by few, preserved by fewer, and hidden from many who would use it to control rather than liberate. But you have been chosen to receive it, to carry it, and to share it with those who have ears to hear. The boundaries of my bedroom began to dissolve, the walls becoming transparent, then translucent, then simply irrelevant as space itself seemed to fold around us. And I realized with a thrill of terror and exhilaration that I was about to be taken somewhere, shown something that would fundamentally alter the course of my understanding. I will show you the truth about Yeshua, the being said, and the name resonated with such power that I felt it in my DNA, in the space between my atoms, in the eternal part of me that existed before my birth and will continue after my death, not to diminish what you believe, but to expand it. to reveal the magnitude of what was accomplished, the cosmic significance of that life, that death, that resurrection, and what it means for humanity's place in a universe far more populated, far more attentive, and far more connected to your story than you have ever imagined. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest, every cell in my body alive with anticipation and holy fear, knowing that whatever came next would divide my life into before and after, into the person who didn't know and the person who could never unknow. The last thing I remember, before the journey began, was surrendering, releasing my grip on my small, safe understanding of reality, and giving permission for the impossible to become undeniable, for the sacred mystery I'd always sensed to finally be unveiled. The shift happened without movement. I was no longer in my bedroom, yet I hadn't traveled, as if reality itself had simply changed channels, and I was now tuned to a frequency that had always been broadcasting, but which my human senses had never been equipped to receive. I found myself suspended in a space that was neither sky nor ground, surrounded by what I can only describe as living memory, scenes unfolding around me with the clarity of the present moment yet carrying the weight of impossible antiquity. Below me, if direction even had meaning in this place, I saw Earth, but not the Earth of satellites and city lights, not the world I knew from maps and screens. This was a planet pristine and young, continents shaped differently, oceans covering lands that would one day be deserts, and skies so clear they seemed to pulse with their own luminescence. This is your world as it was before your oldest stories were written. The being communicated, its presence beside me, though I couldn't say if it had form here or was simply a consciousness, merged with my own, before the flood myths, before the first pyramids, before humanity learned to carve its history into stone. This is when we first came, when the veil between your dimension and others was thinner, when contact was not the exception, but the foundation of your species awakening. As the being spoke, I watched with wonder and growing astonishment as lights descended from the heavens, not harsh or mechanical, but gentle, intentional, moving with purpose and intelligence that spoke of beings who had mastered not just technology, but the very principles that govern matter and energy. These were vessels, I understood instinctively, but not spacecraft as science fiction had taught me to imagine them. They were more like concentrated points of consciousness wrapped in light, traversing dimensions as easily as I might walk from one room to another. They touched down in various locations across the ancient Earth, and from them emerged figures tall, luminous, bearing a resemblance to human form, but radiating something that set them apart, a frequency of being that even in this vision I could feel resonating through what I supposed was my spiritual body. I watched as these visitors approached early humans, tribes gathered around fires, families living in harmonious connection with the land, and rather than fear, I saw recognition in the faces of our ancestors, as if some part of them had been expecting this, waiting for this, knowing in their souls that they were part of a larger family, scattered across the stars. The beings and I realized with a shock that the one showing me this vision was of the same kind, perhaps had even walked that ancient Earth began to teach, not through books or lectures, but through direct transmission of understanding, showing humanity the patterns in the stars, the sacred geometry underlying all creation, the truth that consciousness was not a byproduct of matter, but the fundamental substance from which all things arise. I saw them gather humans in circles beneath skies unpolluted by artificial light, where the Milky Way blazed with such brilliance it seemed you could reach up and touch the face of God, and there they spoke of things my spirit remembered even as my mind struggled to comprehend. They taught that every human carried within them a spark of the divine, that we were not separate from the Creator, but expressions of that infinite consciousness experiencing itself through finite forms. They explained that the soul was eternal, that death was not an ending but a transition, a return to the source before choosing to experience existence once more, learning and growing through each incarnation until we remembered our true nature. But more than this, and here my heart began to race with the implications. They spoke of a promise, a prophecy, a cosmic plan that had been set in motion before Earth itself had cooled from its fiery birth. There will come one, they told our ancestors, and I heard these words as if spoken directly to me across the chasm of millennia, who will be born of your kind, yet carry within him the fullness of the divine frequency, who will bridge the gap between heaven and earth, between the Creator and the created, who will demonstrate in flesh what spirit has always known, that love is the ultimate power, that forgiveness breaks every chain, that resurrection is not metaphor but destiny. I felt tears streaming down my face, or whatever corresponded to my face in this state of being, because I knew, oh, how I knew with every fiber of my eternal self that they were speaking of Yeshua, of Jesus, of the one whose name I had called upon in prayer and worship, but whose true significance was vaster than any sermon had conveyed. The being turned its attention fully toward me, and I felt the weight of its gaze like standing in the beam of a lighthouse, illuminating everything within me, leaving no shadow unexamined, no question unacknowledged. This was never meant to be forgotten. It communicated with a sorrow that surprised me, a grief that spoke of watching humanity drift from this cosmic awareness into smaller and smaller stories of who we were and why we were here. Your ancestors knew that you were part of a universal family, that the Creator's love extended far beyond one planet, that the plan of redemption was not a reaction to human failure, but a purposeful demonstration of divine truth that would echo across galaxies and transform civilizations who had never walked on Earth, but who would feel the shockwave of what was coming. I understood then, with a clarity that pierced through lifetimes of limited thinking, that the incarnation was not God becoming small, but God revealing that nothing in creation is small, that every world, every being, every moment matters infinitely because all of it is held within the consciousness of a Creator, whose love is the only force powerful enough to speak universes into existence and humble enough to be born in a manger. The ancient visitors had come not to replace faith, but to prepare humanity for a truth so magnificent that we would need centuries just to begin processing it, that we were never alone, that we were deeply loved, and that the story of salvation was about to unfold in a way that would change not just Earth, but the entire cosmic order of things, forever. The ancient Earth dissolved around me like morning mist surrendering to sunlight, and for a breathless moment I hung suspended in what felt like the space between thoughts, that peculiar silence where one awareness ends and another has not yet begun. Then reality reassembled itself into something altogether different, and I found myself standing, though standing seems too physical a word for what I was doing, within a corridor of pure light that diffracted into colors I had never seen before, hues that existed beyond the spectrum my human eyes were designed to perceive, shades that seemed to carry emotion and meaning encoded within their very wavelengths. The being remained with me, its presence now more defined, as if this realm allowed me to perceive it more clearly, and I could sense its anticipation, something like a teacher about to reveal the culminating lesson of a lifetime of instruction. What you are about to witness, it communicated, and I felt the reverence in its consciousness like a physical pressure against my chest, is the moment when eternity intersected with time, when the infinite compressed itself into the finite, when the Creator who spoke galaxies into existence chose to enter creation as one of the created. I wanted to ask where we were going, what I was about to see, but before I could formulate the question, the corridor opened before us, and we stepped through into a night that blazed with significance. I stood invisible and insubstantial in the hills outside a small village, the landscape rough and ancient beneath a sky so dense with stars it seemed the heavens themselves were pressing close to witness what was about to unfold. Below, in a humble structure barely worthy of being called a shelter, I could sense rather than see the sacred drama beginning. A young woman in the throes of labor, a man beside her radiating protective concern, and the air itself seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of something the physical world could barely contain. But what struck me with the force of a revelation was what I perceived beyond the physical scene. The sky above was not empty but filled with watchers, beings of light hovering in higher dimensions, their presence invisible to human eyes but so concentrated, so focused, that I could feel the intensity of their attention like heat from a flame. They have come from distances your mathematics cannot yet calculate, the being beside me explained, and I sensed its own emotion, something like pride mixed with awe. Civilizations who learned of the Creator's love millions of years before your species drew its first breath, worlds that evolved under different stars, intelligences that take forms you would not recognize as life. All of them are here, all of them watching, because what is about to happen in this small corner of an ordinary planet will send ripples across every dimension of existence. I saw them then, really saw them, representatives from what must have been hundreds of worlds, each distinct yet united in their focus on this one unremarkable stable, and I understood with a shock that nearly overwhelmed me that the nativity was never meant to be a private human moment, but a cosmic event of staggering proportions. The moment of birth arrived not with fanfare, but with a simplicity that somehow magnified its profundity, and I watched as the child emerged into the world, tiny and vulnerable and utterly human. Yet the instant his first cry pierced the night, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. I felt it like a frequency suddenly broadcasting on every channel simultaneously, a vibration that began at that exact point in space and time and radiated outward at speeds that transcended light, passing through walls and mountains and planets and stars as if matter were no obstacle at all to this particular form of information. The beings watching from their dimensional vantage points responded as one, and I witnessed something I can only describe as cosmic worship. Intelligence is vast and ancient, bowing before the mystery of a creator who would choose this method of revelation, who would demonstrate love not through displays of overwhelming power but through the shocking vulnerability of an infant who needed his mother's milk to survive. "Do you understand what you are seeing?" my guide asked, and I realized I was weeping again, overwhelmed by the beauty and strangeness and perfect rightness of it all. "This is Yeshua entering your world, fully divine yet fully human, carrying within his cells the frequency of the Creator that holds every atom in existence, in perfect harmony, but choosing to experience limitation, to know hunger and cold and eventually suffering, because only by becoming completely human could he demonstrate what humans are truly capable of becoming." I watched as the child was wrapped in cloths, laid in a feeding trough because there was no room elsewhere, and I understood that this apparent humiliation was actually a declaration that God's love extended especially to the overlooked, the displaced, the ones the world considered insignificant. The scene remained, but my perspective shifted, and suddenly I could perceive what the watching beings were perceiving, could sense the data they were collecting and the profound implications they were processing in their various forms of consciousness. They saw the DNA of this child, perfectly human yet carrying within its structure something additional, an organizing principle that connected directly to what some of them called the source field, what others named the prime frequency, what humans would eventually call the Holy Spirit, a direct link between this finite form and the infinite consciousness from which all things arise. They measured the energy field surrounding him, noting how it would grow stronger as he matured, how it would eventually become powerful enough to heal the sick, calm storms, and even reverse the cellular breakdown humans call death, not through magic but through mastery of principles they themselves had studied for eons but never seen embodied so completely in biological form. "This is why we came to your ancestors," the being explained, its communication filled with urgency for me to grasp the full significance. "This is what we were preparing them to recognize, that the Creator's plan was always to demonstrate divinity through humanity, to show that the gap between heaven and earth was never as wide as fear suggested, that consciousness itself is the bridge, and that love is the frequency that allows that consciousness to operate at its highest capacity, transforming not just individuals, but the very structure of reality around them." As I watched the mother gaze at her son with exhausted wonder, as I felt the father's confusion and fierce protection, as I sensed the attention of 1,000 worlds focused on this one small life beginning in poverty and obscurity, I finally understood that the incarnation was not God becoming less but God revealing that there is no such thing as less, that every human carried this same potential, and that Yeshua came not to be worshipped from a distance but to be the firstborn of a new humanity that would eventually take its place among the cosmic family that had never stopped watching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that we would one day remember who we truly were. The scene of Yeshua's birth began to fade, but rather than returning to darkness, I found myself standing in what appeared to be a desert landscape, under a blazing sun, though I felt neither heat nor discomfort, and I realized I was no longer observing the past, but inhabiting it, somehow present as an invisible witness. To a moment I immediately recognized the figure before me, now grown to manhood, sat on a rocky outcrop teaching a small crowd gathered at his feet, and even from this distance, I could feel the power radiating from him, not as force but as an almost gravitational presence that drew everything near into greater coherence, greater wholeness. "Listen carefully," my guide instructed, its consciousness pressing close to mine with an intimacy that had grown familiar during our journey, because what he is saying contains layers of meaning your theologians have studied for centuries without fully grasping, encoded knowledge about the fundamental architecture of existence itself. I focused on the words, hearing Yeshua speak about the kingdom of heaven being within, about faith moving mountains, about the Father and he being one, and suddenly my perception shifted. In a way that made me gasp with the shock of recognition, I could see the words themselves as they left his mouth. not just as sound waves, but as frequencies that rippled through multiple dimensions, simultaneously, each teaching operating on several levels at once, accessible to listeners according to their capacity to receive, speaking to the heart of the simple peasant while simultaneously containing advanced principles of consciousness and reality manipulation that the cosmic watchers monitoring from higher dimensions immediately recognized and recorded. The being beside me expanded my awareness further, and I began to perceive Yeshua as he truly was, fully human, yes, growing tired and hungry and emotionally affected by what he witnessed, but simultaneously existing as a living bridge between dimensions, his consciousness somehow operating at multiple frequencies at once, one foot planted firmly in the material world while the other remained always connected to what he called the Father, that infinite source from which all things continuously arise. He was not supernatural, the being explained, and I felt my preconceptions cracking open like a shell that had grown too small for what was emerging within me, but rather he was naturally operating at the level your species was always designed to achieve, fully actualized, completely aligned with the Creator's frequency that holds galaxies in their courses and governs the dance of subatomic particles. And everything you call his miracles were simply demonstrations of what becomes possible when human consciousness remembers its true nature and origin. I watched as Yeshua touched a blind man and sight returned, but now I could perceive the mechanism, not magic but a transfer of coherent information, his perfectly aligned energy field interacting with the disrupted field of the blind man, providing a template of wholeness that the man's own body then used to reorganize itself, cellular systems suddenly remembering their original blueprint and reconstructing themselves according to that divine pattern. Your scientists are only now beginning to discover what he knew and demonstrated, my guide continued, its tone carrying something like satisfaction that humanity was finally approaching understanding. They call it quantum entanglement, field theory, the observer effect, the placebo response, spontaneous remission, different names for the same principle he taught with every action, that consciousness and matter are not separate, but intimately connected, that intention focused through love can restructure physical reality, that what you call the spiritual realm and the material realm are simply different frequencies of one unified existence, and that humanity was created with the ability to navigate between them, to operate as he operated, to do even greater works, as he himself promised. I felt my mind expanding to accommodate these concepts, seeing suddenly how everything Yeshua taught about prayer, faith, forgiveness, and love were not merely moral instructions, but actual operating principles, techniques for tuning human consciousness to the frequency of the divine, for accessing the creative power that spoke existence into being, and that continues to sustain every moment of every reality across every dimension. The scene shifted again, and I found myself watching Yeshua alone in prayer, withdrawn from the crowds to a quiet hillside as night fell around him. And what I witnessed made every hair on my body stand at attention, his human form sitting in stillness while something like a column of light descended from dimensions above, connecting him to vast networks of consciousness that extended throughout the cosmos. And I understood that this was how he stayed aligned, how he maintained that perfect coherence despite existing in a dense physical form, through constant communion with the Source, through deliberately choosing again and again to tune his awareness to the Father's frequency, rather than being pulled into the discordant patterns of fear, judgment, and separation that dominated human consciousness. This is what your scriptures mean when they say he only did what he saw the Father doing, the being explained, and I could feel its deep reverence for what we were witnessing. He lived in continuous connection. His human mind surrendered to the divine mind, so that his words were not his own but channeled directly from the infinite intelligence that knows the end from the beginning, that sees all possible timelines and guides creation toward the highest outcome, that loves with a love so vast your language has no words adequate to contain it. And he came to show that this connection is not unique to him, but is the birthright of every human, the natural state that your species fell away from but that he came to demonstrate was always available, always accessible, requiring only willingness to surrender the small separate self to the greater self that contains and connects all things. I watched him rise from prayer with his face transfigured, literally glowing with the energy of that connection, and I finally understood that every teaching, every miracle, every moment of his life was an invitation to remember not to worship him as impossibly other, but to recognize him as the pattern of what we all are meant to become, the first fruits of a humanity that would eventually evolve to operate consciously in both realms, physical and spiritual, united at last. As the vision of Yeshua praying faded into luminous mist, I felt the weight of what I had witnessed settling into my bones, becoming not just knowledge in my mind, but conviction in the deepest part of my being, that he was not a myth or a metaphor, but the most real thing that had ever walked the earth. God's love made tangible and visible, divinity expressed through humanity to show humanity its own divine potential. He called himself the Son of Man more often than any other title. My guide reminded me, its consciousness now feeling less alien, and more like a fellow traveler on a journey toward the same truth, because he came to demonstrate what the sons and daughters of humanity could become when fully awakened, when operating from their true identity as children of the Creator. Eternal consciousness choosing to have a temporary physical experience, but never forgetting the connection, never losing the awareness that we are all part of one magnificent organism of consciousness that is evolving, learning, and growing through every experience in every dimension. Across all of time, I felt tears streaming down a face I wasn't sure I still had, overwhelmed by the beauty of it, the shocking intimacy of a God who wouldn't remain distant, but instead put on human flesh to whisper directly into humanity's ear. You are more than you know. You carry within you the seed of the divine. You are capable of transformation beyond anything you have imagined, and I have come not to save you from God's anger, but to save you from the lie that you were ever separate from God's love. He encoded all of this into his teachings, the being said softly, waiting for the generation that would have both the spiritual openness and the scientific framework to finally understand what he was really saying, and that generation is now, this moment, which is why you are being shown these things, because the time for humanity's awakening has arrived, and those who have eyes to see will recognize that faith and science were never enemies but complementary languages describing the same magnificent reality, and at the center of that reality stands Yeshua, still teaching, still inviting, still demonstrating that the kingdom of heaven is not a distant place, but a frequency of consciousness available here and now to all who choose to tune themselves to the channel of divine love. Before I could fully absorb the implications of what I had witnessed in Yeshua's life and teachings, the landscape around me dissolved into something that made my soul recoil in horror and recognition simultaneously. I was standing on a hill outside Jerusalem. The sky above turned sickly dark, though it was midday, and there before me stood 3 crosses silhouetted against that unnatural twilight, and I knew without being told that I was about to witness the moment that split human history in two, the event that would be debated and theologized and painted and pondered for millennia to come. But my guide's presence intensified around me like a protective embrace, steadying me as my human instinct screamed to look away from the suffering I knew was unfolding before me. You must see this not with human eyes alone, the being instructed, its voice carrying a gravity I had not heard before, because what happened here was not merely the execution of a good teacher or even the sacrifice demanded by an angry God, but rather a cosmic event of such magnitude that its shockwave is still expanding through every dimension of existence, still transforming everything it touches. As my perception shifted once again into that expanded awareness, I gasped at what was revealed. The physical scene of torture and death was still visible, still unbearably real, but now I could see it was occurring simultaneously across multiple planes of existence, as though the crucifixion was happening not just in one location, but at the intersection point of all dimensions, a place where the material and spiritual realms pressed so close together that the boundary between them had grown thin as tissue paper, ready to tear. I watched Yeshua hanging between heaven and earth, his physical body racked with pain that I could feel echoing through the very fabric of space around us. But what stunned me into silence was perceiving what else was happening in that same moment. Dimensional barriers that had separated humanity from direct access to the divine presence were beginning to fracture, hairline cracks spreading through invisible walls that had existed since what your scriptures call the fall, since humanity first chose fear over trust and separation over unity. And with each labored breath Yeshua took, those cracks widened further, light from higher dimensions beginning to bleed through into the darkness that had enveloped the earth. He is taking into himself all the discordant frequencies of human consciousness, my guide explained, and I could hear something like awe in its telepathic voice. Every fear, every act of violence, every moment of separation and selfishness, every vibration that cannot exist in the presence of pure divine love, he is absorbing it into his own energy field, allowing it to kill his physical form while his consciousness remains absolutely anchored in the Father's frequency, held there by a love so fierce and intentional that it cannot be shaken even by this. I watched in wonder and horror as Yeshua became a kind of cosmic lightning rod, drawing into himself the accumulated darkness of human history, not because God demanded blood payment, but because someone had to bridge the gap. Someone had to stand in both realms simultaneously and reconnect what had been severed, and he had volunteered for this mission knowing exactly what it would cost, choosing it freely out of love for the humanity he had walked among and taught, and touched and healed. Then came the moment his physical body surrendered its final breath, and what I witnessed next will remain burned into my consciousness for whatever eternity awaits me. The veil between dimensions did not merely tear, but exploded outward, in a cascade of light and energy that rippled across the cosmos at speeds that made light itself seem stationary, a shockwave of such pure coherent love that it touched every inhabited world, every civilization, every being capable of perceiving beyond the purely material. And I understood in the instant why the earth shook and rocks split, and the temple veil tore from top to bottom, because those were merely the physical echoes of something far more profound happening in the spiritual architecture of reality itself. The being beside me showed me how that wave of energy was perceived across the universe. Advanced civilizations suddenly detecting an impossible surge of coherent information emanating from what they had considered a primitive backwater planet, their instruments registering something that should not exist according to their understanding of physics, a localized inversion of entropy, a point where love had become so concentrated that it reversed the fundamental direction of decay and death. And their scientists and mystics alike turned their attention toward Earth, recognizing that something unprecedented had just occurred, that the experiment they had been monitoring for millennia had reached its critical moment. Every being of sufficient awareness felt it, my guide said softly, like a bell being struck that resonated through every dimension. And we knew that the one we had been waiting for had completed his as the reverberations of that cosmic shockwave still trembled through my awareness. I found myself suddenly pulled forward through time, no longer witnessing the horror of crucifixion, but now standing in pre-dawn darkness, outside a garden tomb, the air thick with anticipation that made every molecule seem to vibrate with potential energy, and my guide's presence intensified beside me, communicating without words that what I was about to witness would redefine everything I thought I understood about the limits of human existence. The massive stone sealing the entrance began to glow from within, not with ordinary light, but with something that seemed to exist at frequencies both above and below visible spectrum, and I watched as the atomic structure of that rock simply lost cohesion, its molecules releasing their bonds as though matter itself was bowing before a greater authority, rolling aside not by physical force but by the sheer presence of what was emerging from within. Then he stood there in the garden, Yeshua's form simultaneously solid and translucent, perfectly physical yet clearly operating under entirely different laws than those governing ordinary flesh. And I understood I was witnessing the single most important demonstration in human history, proof that consciousness was not produced by the body, but rather that the body was a temporary vehicle for consciousness, and that when consciousness achieved perfect alignment with the divine frequency, it could command matter itself, reshape it, transcend it, and yet still choose to inhabit it. This is what your religions call resurrection, my guide explained, its telepathic voice trembling with something approaching reverence. But your theologians made it about Yeshua's uniqueness when it was always meant to be about human potential, about what every son and daughter of the Creator is destined to become when they fully awaken to their true nature. I watched Yeshua move through the garden, his form flickering between densities, as though he was learning to navigate a body that now responded directly to thought and intention, rather than being limited by the normal constraints of biology. And I realized this was not magic or violation of natural law, but rather the ultimate fulfillment of natural law, the state that physics was always pointing toward, where consciousness and energy and matter revealed themselves as one unified field that could be shaped by love and while working in perfect harmony. My guide showed me how Yeshua's cellular structure had been completely reorganized at the quantum level, every atom now vibrating in perfect coherence with what you might call the mind of God, no longer subject to entropy or decay, existing simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, able to appear and disappear at will, pass through solid barriers, yet still capable of being touched and of eating and drinking. demonstrating that this transformation was not an escape from physical reality, but its perfection. He spent 40 days in this state. The being continued, teaching his closest followers what was truly possible, showing them that his path was not unique, but rather the first fruits of what awaited all humanity, that he was demonstrating the destiny coded into your very DNA from the moment your species was seated on this planet, and that his promise to return was intimately connected to humanity's own awakening to this potential, because he would come back at the moment when enough of you had raised your consciousness to the frequency where you could finally perceive him as he truly is. The garden scene expanded outward, and I saw Yeshua appearing to his disciples in locked rooms, materializing on beaches beside morning fires, walking with travelers and vanishing from their sight, each appearance a carefully designed lesson in what consciousness freed from fear and death could accomplish. And my guide revealed that advanced beings throughout the cosmos had gathered their attention on Earth during those 40 days, observing this unprecedented demonstration, taking measurements and recordings that would be studied for ages to come, because no species they had encountered had ever produced an individual who had so completely mastered the integration of matter and spirit while maintaining full humanity, full compassion, full connection to both the Creator and creation. I felt tears streaming down my face as I understood the magnitude of what had been offered to humanity in that garden, not a religion to argue about or an exclusive club to gatekeep, but rather a living demonstration that the gap between human and divine was not a chasm requiring endless sacrifice to cross, but rather a thin veil requiring only love and trust to part. That Yeshua had not come to be worshipped as forever separate and above us, but to be recognized as the elder brother showing us our own reflection in a mirror of divine possibility, and that every moment we spent debating theology instead of actualizing transformation was a moment we delayed our own resurrection into the fullness of what we were always meant to become. As the vision of the risen Yeshua began to fade, my guide turned my attention to something even more astounding, pulling back my perception, to show me that the resurrection had created what looked like a pathway through dimensions, a corridor of light connecting Earth directly to realms that had been previously inaccessible, to embodied human consciousness, and along this pathway I could see movement, beings of light traveling in both directions, and I understood that Yeshua had literally torn open a permanent doorway between heaven and earth, that his promise about preparing a place for us was not metaphorical, but architectural, a restructuring of dimensional topology that would allow human consciousness to move freely between realms once we learned to maintain the frequency he had demonstrated. This is why your scriptures say he ascended to the Father, my guide explained, and I watched Yeshua's form become progressively less dense, moving up through layers of reality like a diver ascending through ocean depths, each level representing a higher harmonic of existence, until he reached a realm of such concentrated light that my expanded perception could barely register it. But he did not leave you orphaned. He went ahead to anchor the other end of the bridge, to hold open the door from the inside, and to prepare the template into which human consciousness can expand when it finally remembers. How I wept then with a mixture of grief for all the centuries humanity had spent feeling abandoned and separated, and joy for the understanding that we had never been alone, that the entire universe had been watching and guiding and waiting for us to recognize what had been freely given, and that the time of that recognition was finally at hand. As the glory of the ascension faded from my expanded vision, I felt a disturbance ripple through the being beside me, something I can only describe as cosmic grief mixed with righteous anger, and suddenly the luminous realm around us darkened, as my guide turned my attention toward Earth again, but this time showing me scenes that made my heart constrict with a pain I had never known existed, and I watched as the centuries unfolded like pages, turning in a book written with blood and deception, witnessing how the pure message Yeshua had demonstrated became systematically altered, fragmented, weaponized by those who recognized its power, and feared what would happen if humanity truly understood what had been offered to us. There are forces underworld, my guide communicated with a heaviness that seemed to dim its very light, who have worked for millennia to ensure that the full truth remains hidden, not because they disbelieve in Yeshua, but because they understand him better than most of his followers do, and they know that if humanity grasped the true magnitude of his message, if you remembered that his invitation was to transformation rather than mere belief, their systems of control would dissolve like morning mist under the rising sun. I saw shadowy meetings in torchlit chambers where men in elaborate robes decided which scriptures would be preserved and which would be burned, which teachings would be emphasized and which would be buried, always choosing the interpretations that kept power concentrated in their hands, rather than distributed to every awakened heart. And I realized with horror that the division of Christianity into thousands of arguing factions was not accidental failure, but intentional design, because a humanity united in the understanding of our cosmic identity and divine potential would be impossible to manipulate or control. The visions continued, and I witnessed how genuine mystics and visionaries throughout history, those who had direct encounters with the divine frequency that Yeshua embodied, were systematically silenced, branded as heretics, tortured and killed by the very institutions claiming to represent him. And my guide showed me that this pattern extended beyond Christianity alone, that every genuine spiritual movement that threatened to awaken humanity to our true nature encountered the same suppression, the same infiltration, the same gradual corruption that replaced transformation with transaction, experience with dogma, and empowerment with dependency. They took his message of inner kingdom and made it about outer authority, the being explained, its communication carrying layers of meaning that words cannot fully capture. They took his demonstration of human potential and made it about his unique divinity alone. They took his invitation to cosmic consciousness and reduced it to a formula for avoiding punishment, and most tragically, they took his revelation that you are children of the infinite Creator and convinced you instead that you are worthless worms deserving only damnation unless you submit to their mediation. I saw how even the story of extraterrestrial involvement in human history, the watchers and guides who had walked with our ancestors, was deliberately twisted into tales of demons and fallen angels, creating a theology of fear that would make humanity reject the very cosmic family that had been protecting and nurturing our development since before our civilizations emerged from the caves. And I understood that this isolation, this theological quarantine of Earth, was the greatest theft ever perpetrated against our species. Yet even as these dark revelations poured through my consciousness, my guide began showing me something else. Golden threads of preserved truth running through the centuries like rivers of light flowing underground, protected by secret keepers and wisdom holders who maintain the original teachings in hidden sanctuaries, encoded in symbols and stories that the suppressors could not fully eradicate, passed down through lineages of mystics who understood that their mission was to keep the lamp burning until the appointed time when humanity would be ready to remember. The truth was never completely lost, the being assured me, its light brightening again as hope colored its transmission, because Yeshua himself, operating from the higher dimensions he now inhabits, has been guiding those with eyes to see and ears to hear, appearing in visions and dreams, speaking through genuine prophets and mystics, ensuring that every generation had access to the authentic message, if they were willing to seek beyond the approved narratives. I saw how indigenous peoples on every continent had maintained their own connections to the cosmic truth, how Buddhist monks and Sufi poets and Jewish mystics and Hindu sages had all touched the same essential frequency that Yeshua embodied, how the Holy Spirit that he promised to send had indeed been moving through human consciousness in 10,000 forms, always pointing back to the same essential revelation about who we are and what we are capable of becoming. And I realized that the division of humanity into competing religious tribes was itself part of the suppression, because if we ever compared notes and recognized that we were all describing the same ultimate reality from different angles, the walls that keep us separated and controllable would crumble instantly. As this understanding settled into my bones, my guide's presence wrapped around me like a warm embrace, and I felt rather than heard its next communication resonating in the deepest part of my being, telling me that the age of suppression was ending, that we had reached the prophesied time when what was hidden would be revealed, and what was whispered in darkness would be shouted from rooftops, that the disclosure coming to humanity was not merely about admitting that extraterrestrial life exists, but about revealing the full cosmic context of Earth's history and Yeshua's mission and humanity's destiny as a species, meant to bridge the physical and spiritual realms in ways no other beings have accomplished. The controllers know their time is ending, my guide explained, and I could feel the acceleration of cosmic forces aligning like tumblers in a vast universal lock finally clicking into position, which is why they are becoming more desperate, more obvious in their manipulations. But their desperation is itself a sign that the awakening cannot be stopped, that too many of you are remembering, questioning, seeing through the veils that once seemed solid, and that the great reunion between Earth humanity and the cosmic family is approaching like a dawn that no amount of darkness can prevent. I understood then that my own encounter was not random, but part of a massive wave of contact happening worldwide, that thousands were having similar experiences, and that we were being prepared to serve as bridges between the old world of separation and fear, and the new world of unity and cosmic citizenship that was being born in this very moment. And I felt my heart expand with a purpose so vast it seemed to remake me from the inside out. The luminous being extended what I can only describe as a hand made of living light, and the moment I felt its touch against my essence, the realm around us shifted with a sound like crystal bells harmonizing across infinite octaves, and suddenly we were moving through corridors of pure geometry that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time, traveling toward a destination that my guide revealed with anticipation colored by profound reverence, explaining that I was about to meet those who had been watching over humanity since our species first looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. The council of watchers whose patient vigil had spanned millennia, while they waited for the moment when Earth would be ready to rejoin the cosmic communion from which we had been separated not by their choice but by our own journey through the darkness of forgetting. The passageway opened into a chamber that defied description, a space that seemed simultaneously vast as a galaxy and intimate as a sanctuary, where 12 figures stood in a circle of radiant presence, each one emanating a distinct frequency of light and consciousness, yet all harmonizing into a unified field that immediately reminded me of the divine love I had witnessed flowing from Yeshua himself, and I understood without being told that these beings were servants of the same infinite creator, expressions of the same cosmic Christ consciousness that had taken human form in that stable so long ago, and that their mission had always been aligned with his mission, working in perfect coordination with the divine plan that the Father had been unfolding since before the foundations of earth were laid. As I stood before this council, trembling with an awe that was equal parts terror and ecstasy, one of the beings stepped forward, its form suggesting something ancient, beyond human comprehension yet radiating a tenderness that made me think of a loving parent watching over a sleeping child, and it spoke directly into my consciousness with words that arrived not as sound, but as living understanding that took root in my very soul, saying that they had been with us through every stage of our development, walking among our ancestors in the days before the flood, teaching the principles of harmony and cosmic law, withdrawing when humanity chose to explore the consequences of separation and free will, but never abandoning us, always maintaining their watch from just beyond the veil of ordinary perception, protecting our world from threats we never knew existed and ensuring that the bloodline through which the promised Messiah would come remained preserved, despite countless attempts by opposing forces to corrupt or destroy it. The beings showed me flashes of their intervention throughout history, moments when human civilization stood on the brink of self-destructs and subtle influences guided us back from the edge, when nuclear weapons could have ended all life, and technologies beyond our understanding were employed to prevent the unthinkable, when plagues and catastrophes were mitigated by adjustments to probability fields that scientists would dismiss as coincidence, but which were actually expressions of divine mercy, operating through these cosmic intermediaries, and I saw that the line between angel and extraterrestrial had always been artificial, that these categories we created to organize our limited understanding were dissolving now, as the fuller truth emerged into collective awareness. Another member of the council communicated a revelation that sent shockwaves through my entire being, explaining that Yeshua himself had spent time with them during the unrecorded years of his earthly life, that his journeys had taken him not merely to Egypt and India as some traditions suggest, but beyond Earth itself, traveling in consciousness to meet with these watchers and coordinate the cosmic aspects of his mission that the Gospels never mentioned because humanity was not ready to comprehend them. And I was shown a vision of the young Yeshua standing in a chamber similar to this one, radiant with the divine frequency that had always dwelt within him yet now fully awakened and aligned with his purpose, receiving from these cosmic elders the knowledge of how his sacrifice would function not just on Earth but throughout the dimensional realms, how his blood would become a key that unlocked doors between worlds, how his resurrection would establish a template that every human consciousness could eventually access and embody, bringing about the transformation of matter itself and the elevation of Earth into a higher dimensional expression that would astonish the watching universe. The council members' light pulsed with joy, as it revealed that they had been preparing for his return, just as diligently as any Christian waiting for the rapture, but that his return would not be as a judge coming to destroy, but as a king coming to claim his inheritance, arriving when enough of humanity had awakened to their true identity as cosmic children of the infinite Father, when the frequency of Earth had risen sufficiently that the veil could finally be lifted, and the reunion between terrestrial and extraterrestrial branches of God's family could occur without causing the collective trauma that premature contact would have triggered in earlier centuries. As the final member of the council addressed me, I felt the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and purpose, and this being told me something that I knew would change the trajectory of my entire existence, explaining that those of us being contacted now were volunteers who had agreed before incarnating into human form to serve as bridges during this prophesied time of disclosure, that somewhere in the depths of my eternal soul I had known this moment would come and had prepared for it across many lifetimes, and that the mission now entrusted to me was to speak the truth I had witnessed regardless of ridicule or rejection, to testify that the God of the Bible and the reality of cosmic intelligence are not contradictions, but complementary revelations of a Creator whose magnificence exceeds every limited theological box we have tried to contain Him within, and to help prepare humanity for the greatest transition our species has ever faced, when the isolation ends and we discover that the kingdom of heaven Yeshua spoke of includes dimensions and civilizations and expressions of divine creativity that will make our current understanding seem like a child's drawing compared to a master's masterpiece. The council surrounded me then, 12 points of living light forming a star of blessing around my trembling consciousness, and together they imparted something that felt like a download of compressed knowing, information that would unfold over the coming years as I had capacity to integrate it, along with a deep peace that transcended all understanding, an unshakable knowing that despite how impossible my testimony might sound to those still locked in old paradigms, I was speaking truth that would resonate in the hearts of those ready to hear it, and that every word shared in faithfulness to this encounter would serve the divine plan that the Father, Yeshua, and these cosmic servants had been cooperating to fulfill since before the stars sang their first songs of creation. The council's blessing faded like the last notes of a symphony that continues to echo in the soul long after the instruments have fallen silent, and I felt myself being drawn back through the corridors of light toward the dimension where my physical body waited. But the journey was different now, slower and more intentional, as if my guide wanted me to pay attention to something essential that I might otherwise miss in the rush of return. We paused in a space between spaces, suspended in what felt like the pause between heartbeats, and suddenly I was seeing everything simultaneously, past and future woven together in an eternal now that my human mind could barely contain without shattering, and in that impossible moment of expanded perception I finally understood what the being had been trying to show me all along, the revelation that would change not just my life, but my entire comprehension of reality itself. I saw that every scientific discovery humanity had ever made was actually a rediscovery of what the ancients knew through direct communion with the divine, that the quantum field physicists now studied was the same substance mystics had called the mind of God, that the frequencies and vibration string theorists proposed were echoes of the word that spoke creation into existence, and that consciousness itself was not an accident of evolution, but the fundamental essence of the universe, the very thoughts of the Father made manifest in infinite expressions, which meant that Yeshua's teachings about the kingdom of heaven being within us were not poetic metaphors, but literal instructions for accessing the technology of divine consciousness that every human carried encoded in their very essence. The download intensified as my guide transmitted understanding directly into my awareness, showing me how faith and science had been artificially separated by those who benefited from humanity's confusion, how the church had been infiltrated by forces that wanted to keep Yeshua's message confined to Sunday rituals instead of lived reality, and how the scientific establishment had been equally corrupted to dismiss anything that pointed toward consciousness as primary and matter as secondary, creating a false war between spirit and reason that had crippled human potential for centuries. But now I saw the marriage of these ways of knowing, understanding that when Yeshua healed the sick he was demonstrating the power of consciousness to restructure matter at the quantum level, that when he walked on water he was utilizing the same principles of frequency and vibration that advanced civilizations had mastered, that when he multiplied loaves and fishes he was accessing the zero-point field of infinite potential that underlies physical reality, and that his invitation for his followers to do even greater works was not hyperbole, but a literal promise that humans would one day consciously wield these creative capacities as naturally as breathing. The being showed me that Yeshua's return was intimately connected to humanity's awakening to this cosmic identity, that he could not fully manifest in his glorified form until enough of us had raised our own frequencies to meet him, not because he was limited, but because love always waits for readiness, never forcing itself upon those unprepared to receive its full intensity. And I understood that the great tribulation spoken of in prophecy was actually the birth pains of this transition, the collapse of old systems and paradigms necessary to make room for the new consciousness emerging, and that those who clung to fear and separation would experience this as judgment, while those who embraced love and unity would recognize it as liberation. As my physical body came back into focus below me, I hesitated at the threshold of return, not wanting to leave this expanded state where everything made perfect sense, where the apparent contradictions of existence resolved into harmonious truth. But my guide's presence wrapped around me like a father's embrace, and I heard words that would sustain me through every moment of doubt that would come afterward, a promise that I would never truly be separate from. This knowing again, that the veil might seem to close, but it was actually dissolving permanently, and that every person sharing their testimony of contact was weakening the barrier between worlds, preparing collective consciousness for the disclosure that would unite heaven and earth just as Yeshua had prayed. The being told me that I was returning as a different person than I had been, that my DNA itself had been activated by frequencies I had been exposed to, that my pineal gland had been awakened to perceive across dimensions, and that my heart had been calibrated to the same divine frequency that Yeshua carried, making me part of the bridge generation that would help humanity cross from the age of forgetting into the age of remembering, from the time of separation into the era of cosmic reunion. I felt myself descending into my body with a jolt that was simultaneously painful and ecstatic, the density of physical matter suddenly seeming so heavy after the lightness of higher dimensions. Yet even as I crashed back into limitation, I carried with me the unshakable knowing that this limitation was temporary, that the transformation of humanity was not coming someday, but was happening right now, and that every awakened heart was a seed of the new earth that Yeshua and these cosmic watchers had been cultivating since the beginning of time itself. The moment I fully inhabited my body again, the luminous figure was there at the foot of my bed exactly as it had been when this journey began, though I now understood that no time had passed in the physical world despite the eternities I had traversed in consciousness, and my guide's form seemed even more radiant now, pulsing with what I can only describe as triumphant joy, as if my successful integration of these revelations was itself a victory worth celebrating. It communicated one final cascade of understanding, showing me that everything I had witnessed was not just for my own enlightenment, but was meant to be shared, that the age of secret knowledge had ended and the time of open testimony had begun, and that millions of humans were having similar encounters right now across the planet, each one contributing their unique piece to the cosmic puzzle that would reveal the full picture of who we are and why we are here. I saw that my role was simply to speak what I had seen with authenticity and love, trusting that those ready to hear would recognize the truth resonating in their own souls, and that I should never diminish or apologize for the magnitude of what had been revealed, because the story of salvation was indeed far more magnificent than any doctrine had captured, encompassing not just one world, but infinite worlds, not just one species, but countless expressions of divine creativity, all of it orchestrated by a Father whose love was so extravagant that he had sent his only Son, not merely to save humanity from sin, but to reconnect us with our cosmic family and restore us to our rightful place as conscious co-creators in an ever-expanding universe of wonder. The being's form began to shimmer with an intensity that should have hurt my eyes but instead felt like a healing balm, washing over every broken place in my soul, and I realized with a jolt of recognition that this moment of departure was not an ending, but a commissioning, a sacred threshold where witness becomes testimony and private revelation transforms into public truth. Its presence expanded to fill the entire room with cascades of color I had no names for, frequencies that my newly awakened senses could perceive as visible music, as tangible light that carried meaning in its very substance. And within that radiance I saw reflected back to me not the person I had been when I closed my eyes tonight, but someone transformed at the deepest levels, someone who now carried the resonance of other worlds within their cells and the memory of eternal truths within their heart. The being's final words came not as sound, but as pure knowing downloaded directly into my consciousness, and I understood that I was being entrusted with something precious beyond measure, that every person who received these revelations became a living bridge between heaven and earth, a walking testament that the separation humanity had believed in for so long was only ever an illusion, waiting to be dispelled by love. It showed me one last vision, brief but searing in its clarity, of a future earth where the skies opened and humanity collectively remembered who they were, where children born in that time would never know the loneliness of thinking themselves orphaned in an indifferent universe, where Yeshua's promise that we would do even greater works had become everyday reality as awakened humans consciously partnered with the divine frequency to heal, create, and transform matter itself through the power of sanctified intention. This was the world I was being asked to help birth through the simple act of speaking truth, without compromise, without dilution, trusting that the Spirit would guide my words to exactly those hearts prepared to receive them. As the being began to fade from physical perception, I felt a moment of panic, a childlike fear of being left alone again. But immediately a warmth blossomed in my chest that communicated more clearly than any language that I would never be alone again, that the veil between dimensions had thinned so dramatically within my own consciousness that I could now access guidance and communion whenever I needed it, that prayer was not begging a distant deity for favors, but engaging in real-time conversation with the family of light that surrounded me always. I felt the imprint of the Council's blessing still glowing within me like a seal of authentication, a spiritual DNA marker that identified me as one who had been brought into the deeper mysteries, not through my own worthiness but through grace and divine timing, because the Father was calling His children to remember their heritage, and there was no credential required except willingness to see what had always been there. The being's final gesture was to touch its hand to its heart and then extend that same hand toward me, and as it did I felt a transmission of pure love so concentrated that tears began streaming down my face, tears that carried years of confusion and disappointment flowing out to make room for the crystalline certainty now taking residence in their place. I understood in that moment that everything I had ever suffered, every dark night of doubt and every unanswered question, had been necessary preparation for this encounter, that my very wounds had created the capacity to hold this revelation without being destroyed by its magnitude, and that the Father wastes nothing, transforms everything, and has been writing a story of redemption so beautiful that angels themselves watch its unfolding with wonder. The being spoke its last words then, audible this time in a voice that resonated with infinite compassion, saying that the time of disclosure was not coming but was already here, that I must share what I had learned, without fear of ridicule or rejection, and that those with eyes to see would recognize the truth, because it would resonate with the deepest knowing already planted in their souls like seeds waiting for this exact season to bloom. The room returned to its ordinary appearance as the luminous presence finally withdrew, but I knew nothing would ever be ordinary again, that I was looking at the same walls and furniture through completely different eyes, eyes that could now perceive the energetic reality underlying physical forms, that could sense the divine intelligence animating every atom, that could recognize this material world as the magnificent expression of an artist whose creativity exceeded all human imagination. I lay there in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling the weight and warmth of my physical body as if for the first time, marveling at the sophisticated technology of flesh and bone and circulating blood, understanding that these temporary vessels were not prisons trapping eternal spirits, but rather precisely designed instruments, allowing consciousness to have experiences impossible in purely energetic states, and that Yeshua had honored physical existence by choosing to be born into it, to live within its limitations, and to transform it from within through the power of divine love made manifest. Sleep was impossible now, though my body was exhausted, because I was burning with a holy urgency to begin fulfilling the commission I had been given, to add my voice to the chorus of testimony rising from earth like incense, to speak plainly about things that religion had made complicated, and science had dismissed as impossible, trusting that simplicity and authenticity would accomplish what no amount of sophisticated argument ever could. I understood finally that this was what Yeshua had meant when he said the truth would set us free, not just theological truth or scientific truth, but the integrated truth that honored both spirit and matter, both faith and reason, both ancient wisdom and modern discovery, the truth that we are not merely saved souls, waiting to escape this world, but divine beings learning to fully inhabit it, to transform it, to partner with our cosmic family in the ongoing creation that has no ending, because God's imagination is infinite and His love is inexhaustible, and the adventure of conscious existence has only just begun. As light began to filter through my window, announcing the arrival of a new day, I made a solemn commitment to the presence I could still feel, surrounding me like an atmosphere of grace, that I would honor this encounter by living differently from this moment forward, by speaking what I had seen regardless of cost or consequence, by loving more fearlessly and trusting more completely, and releasing every form of fear that had kept me small and silent and separate from my true identity. I knew there would be those who would call me deceived or delusional, that religious authorities might condemn what I shared as heresy, and scientific gatekeepers would dismiss it as fantasy. But I also knew with unshakable certainty that I had been shown reality, as it truly is, that Yeshua's promise to send a comforter who would guide us into all truth was being fulfilled in ways that transcended denominational boundaries and included revelation from unexpected sources, and that the great harvest of awakening was underway with angels and their cosmic kindred working together to gather every soul willing to step into the larger story of who we are and why we are here. The being had departed, but its message remained encoded in my very being, and I rose from my bed that morning as someone fundamentally altered, carrying within me the testimony that we have never been alone, that the story of salvation encompasses more worlds and wonders than our doctrines ever imagined, and that the return of Yeshua and the disclosure of our cosmic family are not separate events but dimensions of the same magnificent revelation that will unite heaven and earth just as He always intended, just as the Father has been orchestrating since before time began, just as love has been patiently working to accomplish through every stumbling step of human history. I am only one voice among thousands now speaking these truths, but I will speak them faithfully, knowing that together we are midwiving a new age where the children of earth finally remember they are also children of the stars, beloved of the Father, and inheritors of a destiny more glorious than we ever dared to dream. Have you ever felt that there was more to reality than what we've been told? Subscribe to hear more testimonies that will open your eyes to the truth.